Howard, the baby's dead. It's been years since I've thought of that phrase, but I grew up hearing it now and then as my parents told the story of how clarity can be the victim of circumstance. It might give you pause to think how those 5 words could be misconstrued until you understand that my father was a funeral director in an era when children died far more often in the crib than they do now. So getting a panicked phone call announcing the death of a child, while as tragic as it still is, was not as uncommon as one might think, especially not in a funeral home. The fact that on that day he did not recognize the voice of his own wife in her despair might have deprived you of this story had she not recognized that he didn't know she was talking about his own child, until she added, "Howard, it's Kay. Ronnie's dead." Since I lived in that house in later years, I can easily visualize my mother entering that little rose-patterned room in which I slept, and finding me at 3 months of age not breathing as I lay in my crib, snatched me into her arms and bolted for the phone. For those born in this modern age, it may be hard to imagine the state of healthcare in the mid-50s rural town Canada. Things were a lot simpler, further apart, and harder to connect in those days. I mentioned that my dad was a funeral director. He also had the contract for the ambulance service, which meant that there was a station wagon set up to respond to accident scenes in those situations where a family couldn't get their loved ones to the hospital on their own. For those who've never seen a station wagon, picture a low-slung SUV with a long back end and no back seats. Doctors visited the house where the patient lived to determine if they could be looked after at home or if they needed the professional care of a hospital. The doctor was the emergency department, and the only wait times were to find him, have him triage the situation in light of what else he had ahead of him that day, and then wait for him to show up. Yes, him. Don't be mad at me. I was less than a year old at the time. I truly didn't have a voice. Generally, that meant playing phone tag through his office, who would know where he was and the number to reach him there, when he wasn't in transit. At that time, even numeric pagers were years in the future. So, in the circumstances, calling 911 would likely just have gotten the lady down the street. Yeah, 3, not 10 digits in a phone number. Like a lot of businesses of the time, the funeral home was a family business, my father being the 3rd generation to have worked it. We actually lasted 4 generations, but that's a story for another time, as it's not relevant to the day of my death. The point of telling it being a family business is that my parents were renting an apartment in a house on the funeral home property. That apartment was only 2 houses away from the funeral home where my father worked all hours of the day and night. From the time he dropped the phone receiver at work, phones were attached to the wall with wires back then, till he burst through the kitchen door was seconds. There will be those who, knowing me through the years, will argue with you as to just when brain damage starts with oxygen deprivation, or speculate how long I lay in my crib not breathing. But as I think of the story my parents would tell of my father grasping me from my mother's arms, taking me by the ankles, turning me upside down, and for the first, but certainly not the last time in my life, repeatedly smacking my ass, I tend to think I got away pretty lucky. And no, it wasn't actually my ass, but my back he smacked. But I can't help but take a little literary license there. I remember in hearing him telling the story, he'd say he had no idea if I was choking on something or what the problem was, only that he needed to hear me take that next breath. In his work of manning the ambulance, he delivered or assisted in delivering more than a couple of babies in the middle of the night in rural Nova Scotia, and knew that a newborn's instinctive reaction to that kind of stimulus was to gasp. No doubt, medical practice has reviewed, studied, and reported to the 9th degree on the practice, but at the time, there were no such thing in rural Nova Scotia as first responders, just the guys who drove the ambulance. However, as a teenager digging through our home library and finding the dog-eared, spine-wore, and note-smudged medical texts that were required curriculum of a licensed embalmer, I'm pretty sure fate was definitely in my corner that morning. Yes, as a 3-month-old child, I gasped that next breath, and for years after, every once in a while, I'd overhear either my mom or my dad telling some new friend dear enough to share that story that more often than not left my mom and dad holding hands. Well, over the years, various people, including my older brother, have tried to kill me. It was less than 20 years ago when I experienced death for the second time. As I likely wouldn't have died except for why I was in the recovery room, I can't say that it was lucky for me that's where I was. But that is why I can tell that story another time.